In this video, we're going to start off with inspecting and cleaning the air filter element, which means we need to first remove the fuel tank. After you oil the filter element, you need to let it sit for at least 20 minutes for the oil to permeate through the filter before you install it back on the bike. I just let mine sit overnight and I'm ready to put it back in right now. Before doing that, you want to make sure that you don't have any of that oil on the seating surface where this is going to clamp around the snorkel intake. A good wipe down with a mixture of water and isopropyl alcohol takes care of that. And check and see if your filter has any specific orientation. The round OEM filter just goes in, but these ones that have a particular shape will usually have some arrows telling you which way faces up, like this one does. So we'll just go ahead, slide that back in place until it seats all the way in, and then we'll go ahead and screw that hose clamp to tighten it. And I'm going to hold the filter in place just to make sure it doesn't slip around on me while I do that. This clamp actually does have a torque spec. It's 22 to 24 inch-pounds. So I'm going to switch to my torque wrench so that I can finish that off to spec. There we go. We're ready to put the airbox cover back on. Before we do that, we're going to make sure that we wipe away any bits of dirt that may be on the sealing surfaces. It's going to interfere with the seal. Do the same thing with the lower airbox and make sure that you're checking as you do this to inspect the overall quality of that rubber gasket that's in there to see if that's going to need to be replaced. Okay? Of course, don't forget to remove any towels that you may have used to block off those intake stacks. And then put the cover back on top. And now we're ready to put all the screws in. There is a torque spec for the screws, but there's not really a torque sequence in the book. So I'm just going to alternate going around. Just getting them kind of seated to start with. And then just kind of going back and forth as I put these all back in. And the torque spec for these screws is 22 to 27 inch-pounds. And so I'm just going to kind of do the same thing and go in a pattern to make sure I tighten them all down evenly. And the last bit for the airbox is, of course, making sure that we plug back in that sensor connector. It just pushes on there and it'll lock in place. Usually at this point I'd be ready to bring the fuel tank back over and put that on the bike. But notice I got this piece of tape on my handlebars with a note that says I need to torque my stem bolt, because in the last video when I adjusted the steering stem, I was not able to get a torque wrench in here with the fuel tank in place to properly torque that bolt. It's just in there hand tight right now. But now I have room to get my torque wrench in there and finish that off, and then also put my steering stabilizer back in place before I put the tank back on. Alright, so make sure the bars are turned all the way to the right to give me some room. It is a T45 bit and the torque spec is 15 to 18 foot-pounds. It's still a little tight getting in here with the stabilizer bracket and this brake line, but I should have enough room to get in here. Make sure we're all the way seated good. And now I can tighten that up, make sure I'm not putting any pressure on that brake line as I do so. Alright, next is reinstalling that screw that holds that brake line clamp there. And that gets set to 62 to 80 inch-pounds. And of course, while I'm here, we'll reinstall the steering damper, the pivot screw. Right here is a T45, and I'm just going to hand snug that for now. And then the rod screw here is a T30. So line that up, and again just going to snug it finger tight for now. And then the torque on the pivot screw is 15 to 16 foot-pounds. And the rod screw is 89 to 106 inch-pounds. That's all set. Now I can remove my little reminder note. Alright, so I'm not quite ready to put the tank on just yet. I'm going to put this piece that the rear of the tank bolts to on first. Remember, I took this off, I took these side panels off just to have a little bit more access to be able to see to get to those connectors. Putting the connectors on is a little bit easier. And also, I can't get a tool in here once the tank is on to set these screws to the proper torque spec. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. And the spec for these is 71 to 89 inch-pounds. And this is the one that's tricky. If the tank was here, you would need a really long, what is this, T30 bit to be able to get down in this access hole. With the tank out of the way, I can use a regular one and kind of come at it from the side. And now, we're finally ready to grab the tank and wrestle it back on the bike. Alright, just carefully slip it over the air box, watching the clearance at the bars and the risers. Okay. And just set that down in place for now. Now, remember I tied a wire to the end of my fuel line to help me fish it through. Alright, so here's the end of the fuel line. I got my wire still tied around that, and I'm holding the tank up. The front of it's just kind of resting on the air box to give me some room here. And we're going to fish this wire down. Goes right in between the front of the rear cylinder and that air box. And then lift up the tank a little bit so I can slip the fuel line down without bending it. And then, as I'm pulling through, of course that's also why, remember, I taped up the front of the tank because of any contact with the tank and those crash bars, and just try and guide it down there. It's just settling onto the air box, and make sure I have enough that I can turn and plug that in to the fuel fitting. But I'm not going to click it in just yet because I still need some slack to be able to move. I still got to hook up that fuel pump wire on the other side. Alright, so make sure that you, as you're putting your tank back on, that you still leave that fuel connector loose and accessible. Don't let it get pinched or trapped under anything. And that plugs into the bottom of the fuel pump right on this connector here. Hopefully I got a good enough camera angle that you can see that. It's right behind where the fuel line goes in. And so it goes in with the red connector, or the red locking tab facing down, and just pushes in. You feel the click, and then push up. That red locking connector goes up towards the fuel pump part, and then that locks it in place. Not a bad idea, just to double check that your fuel line is on there good and secure while you're here before you button everything down. Once you have those connectors on, make sure that the tank is properly and fully seated in place. And then we're just going to start putting the mounting bolts back in. And just to get them started, right, I'm not going to torque them down until I have all of them in, but we start with the one at the rear. And that is a lock nut, so I'm not going to be able to get that on finger tight, but that's fine where that is, and we'll move ahead to the front mounts. And then these front screws go in, of course, the same way they came out. And remember, the one on the left side is a little trickier, so I would actually recommend doing the one on the right side first, just to make sure that the tank is lined up properly. Of course, don't tighten it in all the way, but just enough to get things started. And then same thing here, just enough to get it started. Okay. And now that all 3 points are at least started, I'll come back with the torque wrench and set them properly. 18 to 21 foot-pounds for the rear mounting nut. 89 to 102 inch-pounds for the front ones. I've already taken the tape that I had protecting the tank from the crash bars. Now it's time to take the connectors, the vent hoses, and the fuel sender connector at the front that we disconnected and get those routed and connected back into place. Hopefully you can see what's going on here. It's always tricky with these up close shots and hard to see areas. So we got the electrical connector coming down here, and then the two hoses, and the thicker hose, like I said, on my bike doesn't connect to anything. The thinner one, it's going to route down behind the frame in front of the front cylinder there, and we'll leave that for now. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then this electrical wire one, the connector for the fuel sensor, remember that is the one that was clipped on a little bracket there, and then the plug is in the front. And so we'll just kind of get down in here again, and remember you have a little bit of room that you can get your fingers in. I apologize, my hand's probably blocking the whole shot. There's a little bit of room that you can get your hand in from behind, but I'm going to have to come around here and guide it in place, and then it pushes back, right, because we pushed it forward to disconnect it. Alright, so that's on there, and then the piece that connects to the front should be hanging out right there, and then they just get in there and clip it in. There's the click, and then push in the little gray retaining tab to keep that on there and secure. And here's that vent tube that I was talking about routing down. It comes behind the frame, this part of the frame here, and just in front of the front cylinder. And of course that's going to go into, here's the other side of it that we took it out earlier. Now remember, from the factory, this has a one-time use ear clamp. Here, just like one of these guys. And it's not a high pressure line. Like I said, it's just a vent tube. I'm sure you could get away with just a regular worm gear hose clamp to make it easier to service, but I have a bunch of these clamps because they're required specifically on fuel injection lines, and I had to service the fuel injection on another bike at one point. So since I have a bunch of them, I figure, why not? I'll go ahead and use them. So I'm going to spray the end of this line with just a light mixture of water and alcohol just to help with getting it in there. I apologize, I'm sure I'm blocking most of the view, but it's kind of tight quarters here to get that down in there. Okay, there we go. And of course you need a special tool to crimp these clamps. Try and keep it so it doesn't spin around on me. Make sure I ain't got no wires in the way. And go ahead and give it a crimp, and there we go. So, sorry if my hands were in the way the whole time as I was doing that, but that's the end result. Now I can reconnect my fuel line, just like so. Push the connector in, and then pull on the connector. Make sure it is seated in there properly. And then the plastic cover just pushes back on to those little rubber bushings. All set. Now I'm ready to reinstall that main fuse I took out earlier. So the fuse, of course, just goes back in the yellow fuse holder. Push it in, make sure it snaps in all the way, gets behind that clip. You should have your parking lights flash as you saw there, and then just put that fuse holder and clip it back so that it's held in with that little black clip right there holding it, and then reinstall that cover that we took off earlier. All set. Now I can put my fuel console trim piece back on top, and of course that just slides in on the back of the tank down there, and then just slips over top the fuel filler cap, and then is secured to the front of the tank. Again, usually with 2 Torque screws. Mine, I have a little different setup because I put something on here to hold straps for my tank bag. So that checks the air filter off the list there, and again that's done every 5,000 miles. And now finally comes what most people think about when you talk about scheduled maintenance on the bike, and that is changing the oil and filter. And the first step for that, according to the service manual, is to get the bike up to operating temperature, which means either riding it for at least 5 minutes or letting it sit for idle for about 10 minutes. All right, once it's warmed up, now I'm going to take it off the center stand, lean it onto the side stand so we can drain the oil. I got my drain pan underneath. I already have the skid plate taken off from before when we started servicing the bike. Got a couple mats just in case we make a mess. And it is a 13 millimeter drain bolt, or 1/2 inch if you got standard wrenches, on the back corner of the crankcase here, right, of course, on the left hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and bust that loose. Okay, and then back it out the rest of the way. Oh, still on a little tight. Okay. All right. Now, as this is starting to taper off, I'll go ahead and loosen the fill plug here, and that should let the rest flow out more freely. Your drain plug is magnetic, so be sure to check the end of it, see if there's any metal shavings or bits on there. This is looking pretty good. Once the oil is done draining, we can go ahead and put the plug back on there. I got a brand new O-ring on there as well. Just thread that up in there and just snug that drain bolt up. Am I going the right way? No, I'm not. Now we are. All right. Snug that drain bolt. All right, and finish it off with the torque wrench. The spec is 15 foot-pounds. There we go. Slid my drain pan over underneath the oil filter, so we'll go ahead and take that off. If it's a little snug, you can get a filter wrench, a little strap wrench to help break it loose here. Just be careful because you do have the wire for the side stand sensor coming here, so just make sure you're not letting that get in the way. All right, that's loosened up. I can get it the rest of the way by hand. There we go. And I'm just going to set that right into that oil pan for now. Wipe off that little bit that hit the wire for the side stand sensor. And I got a brand new oil filter ready to go. I got a little cap full of clean oil that I can lubricate the seal with. Always double check, make sure that the old oil filter seal didn't get stuck up on the surface, and it did not. Let that oil finish draining, and then with some clean oil, lubricate the rubber seal of the new oil filter. And then we thread that on. Of course, always being careful not to let it slip and drop and fall and splash into the tub of used oil you got sitting right here. Move my pan out of the way. I'll bring a mat over just to catch any dribbles. And finish tightening that up. And this just gets hand tight, right? Don't use any wrenches or tools on it. Now I'm ready to fill the bike back up with oil. So we'll get the dipstick out of the way, get a funnel, and we're going to add, to start with, we're just going to add 3 quarts. That's about 3 quarts in there right now. So now we replace the dipstick. And then start the bike and let it run for about 10 seconds. Then we check the level. So we wipe it off, screw it back in, take her out, and we want to add just enough oil to get it to the add mark, the low mark that's on the dipstick there. So I need to add just a little bit. All right, let me see. Let's see if that does it. Of course, then we check again. That's that. And I say that looks pretty good right there. Let me see if I can get a close-up and show you better. Now I'm ready to do a final level check of the oil, which means having the bike back up at operating temperature. So again, letting it idle for about 10 minutes, or at least until you get that engine temperature back up into the 210-ish degree range. Now we just check the level again. And this time you're looking for it to be in between the low and high marks on the dipstick here. And of course that oil gets changed every 5,000 miles at every service interval. A couple other maintenance items that I did not cover. One's going to be rebuilding the front forks. That gets done every 50,000 miles, tearing the forks apart, replacing the seals, replacing the fork oil. And then I think I mentioned earlier, wheel bearings, checking your wheel bearings whenever you have the wheels off for tire changes, and inspecting the rear compensator behind the rear sprocket, again, whenever the wheel is off for a tire change. Remember to replace any parts that you've taken off of the bike to make it easier to do the service. Things like the skid plate, your front fairing, and any other bits you may have removed from the bike while you were servicing it. And that about wraps up maintenance on the Harley Davidson Pan America. For me, this was my 5,000 mile maintenance. I redid a few of those 1,000-mile checks just to show you, and my list is now complete. So hopefully, if you are going to be doing your own maintenance on your bike, this gave you some tips, gave you some pointers on how to do it. And if not, if you're going to take it to a dealer, take it to a shop and let the experts do it, perhaps this video gave you some insight and some appreciation for all the work that goes into maintaining one of these motorcycles. That is it. Thanks for what? Oh, hold on. I did forget one check, and it's the most important one.